Okay, I'll just have a look if it's there on YouTube. Give me a moment, Rabbi, please.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
we are live. Yes,
All right,
perfect.
folks, we are
Baruch
live.
Hashem.
Um, okay, Baruch Hashem for that. Welcome to everybody. Agud Tovach, Shavua Tov. Um, okay, so we're going to be at a little of a challenge. I'm going to do this class only from me speaking, as opposed to um, having the PowerPoint. I'm a bit of a challenge with that right now, but we'll manage. We'll make this good. All right. So,
Rabbi, I'm so
yeah.
sorry. If you would be able to open the PowerPoint presentation on your
No, no,
phone.
no, no. I'm not. No, it's not going to work
Okay, all
because
right.
I didn't send. I just arrived. If I would have arrived earlier and had time, I thought I would get here earlier, and have time to prepare the setup and everything. I didn't even send me the PowerPoint. It's okay. Manage this way. Okay.
Beseder. Okay.
So we know that Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses is speaking to the Jewish people the last 37 days of his life and preparing them to go enter in the land, to enter in the land of Israel, I mean, Canaan. And there are many mitzvahs that will be done on the land, um, gifts that the Israelites have to give to support the Kohanim, the Levim, because they don't get a portion of the land, the priests and Levites, whether it's first fruits, whether it's 10% of the first miser. But then there is also a gift that is, it's a gift that gives yourself. And what it's called Meiser Sheni, if you recall. We've learned this before, the second tithe. And what's unique about this is it's set aside as something that you bring up to Jerusalem and celebrate, right, before God. In the presence of God in the Holy Temple, you would bring it up there. So, um, so the verse tells us, let's get to it. I'm sorry, if you want to follow in your own Chumash, by the way, please do so. Go to Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 12, verse 5 through 7. We're going to read now. Okay? Verses 5 through 7. Okay? So the verse says, only the place that God, your God, will choose from among all of the tribal lands to set his name there, come there to seek his dwelling. When you visit, bring your burnt offerings, sacrifices, second tithes. And it's the same, whether it's any chumash that you use, it's in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 5 through 7. So whether the Gutnick chumash, whether it's the California, the Rebbe's chumash, whatever it is, it doesn't matter because it's the same chapter 12, verse 5 through 7. Okay. So the second tithe separations, and the first ripe fruits you take by hand, your vows and donations, and the firstborn of your cattle and sheep, and you will eat it there. This is what's key over here. Okay. This verse says that you will eat it there before God, your God, meaning that this second tithe you have to eat it before God, right? And you rejoice in all of your endeavors, you and your household, as God, your God, has blessed you, right? So, and speaking about all the various things that you have to bring up to the land, right? To Jerusalem and eat it in the holy city. Now, what's important over here is this is a positive commandment, right? That eat it in the land of, in the city of Jerusalem, right? Now, some laws give us a positive commandment, but also then give us a negative commandment. So if we continue in chapter 12, but now verse 13, skipping to verse 13, says, beware lest you offer up your burnt offerings anywhere you see. So you're not allowed to have burnt offerings elsewhere. But verse 17, we're skipping from 13 to 17, you cannot eat within the cities. You cannot eat within your cities the second tithe of your grain, wine, or oil. What does that mean that you cannot? That's saying the first time it said in verse number 7 that eat it in Jerusalem. But now comes a prohibition that you should not eat it elsewhere. Okay? You can't eat it within any other city. It's a prohibition. All right? So the question, excuse me. So how do we understand this? So Rashi understands this, is going to present the following in a moment. We have a positive commandment, eat in Jerusalem, the second tithe. So we have a mitzvah to have a second tithe. And then we have a mitzvah that second tithe has to be in Jerusalem. So there's two mitzvahs here, second tithe and eating the second tithe in Jerusalem. Those are both positive commandments. So the question is, what is the negative commandment coming to do? So you might think, being that they're separate mitzvahs, let's say you have the mitzvah of second tithes, right? What happens if you can't get to Jerusalem? Right? You can't get to Jerusalem. So what are you going to think? Well, let me eat the second tithe at least, right? Because I have that mitzvah to eat the second tithe. What if I can't make it to Jerusalem? So I'll eat it without. Therefore comes the verse and says, no, you can't do that. Right? That's what it's coming to do. You can't do that. And this is what Rashi explains. So if you look at Rashi on verse number 17, if you have that, you can't. With these words, the Torah comes to add a negative commandment to this matter. Right? You can't. Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha said, you can, but you're not permitted. Okay. So saying on the word you can't, because that's what the verse says. You can't eat it in other cities outside, right, aside from Jerusalem, making it into a negative commandment. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha says, you can, but you are not permitted. Then he continues, Rashi, we can find an example for the following passage. As the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, children of Judah, could not drive them out, as it says in Joshua. They could, but they were not permitted. This was because Avram made a non-aggression pact with them when he purchased the cave of the Machpelah to bury his wife Sarah from them. As explained in Pirkei the Rebbe Eliezer, and this is why when David was about to drive out the Jebusites, they said to him, unless you take away the blind and the lame, you may not enter. As it says in the verse, this was reference to the images that stood in the gates upon which was inscribed the oath of Abraham that had taken regarding the Jebusites. So let's summarize over here. First, Rashi tells us that the words are meant to be understood as a prohibition, right? You can't. It's a negative commandment. Okay, that we get. That makes sense. And others, before that, in verse number 7, we had a positive commandment. Now it's a negative commandment, right? And others, positive commandment is eat it in Jerusalem. Negative commandment is don't eat it anywhere else. So in other words, you're fulfilling two commandments in eating the tithes when you're eating it in Jerusalem. You're fulfilling the positive commandment and not transgressing the negative commandment, right? Then Rashi states our question. Then Rashi states our question, in fact, you can, he quotes, right? But you're not permitted. But Rashi never asks or answers why the Torah says you can't. All he quotes is you can't. He quotes, but he never says why you can't, right? Never answers why the Torah says you can't. Then Rashi provides another example when the Torah uses the phrase you can't, when it means you're not permitted, right? So the word you can't, Rashi's coming to tell you, you're not permitted, right? As we see, Abraham made an oath when he bought the cave of the Machpelah that he would not the Jebusites, who are the descendants of the Hittites, that he would not take from them their land. What was their land? Temple Mount. So he made a promise, made an oath. So what do we see from that? That really before David we could, but we're not permitted. So what does it mean you can't? You can't means you're not permitted. Because you could, right? But you're not permitted. That's what Rashi explains, right? Okay, that's Rashi. So, some questions. Why does Rashi open the door to the question, but stop short of asking or answering it? Like he says, you can't. Why can't you? Why can't you? He doesn't explain, right? He doesn't explain the answer or answering it. He's just making the statement. Why does Rashi give us an example to explain what's going on over here? Why is that necessary? Now, this language is you can't, is a language that's used many times in the Torah. Why did Rashi use this language? Okay, hold on one second. So, before we go into Rashi to understand what's going on over here, when we use the term you can't in the Torah, loy suchal in Hebrew, is the Hebrew term loy suchal, you can't. What does the Torah mean by that? Is it because it's forbidden? Is it because you don't have the capacity? What does it mean you can't? When you say you shall not, we understand that. That's a prohibition, right? You shall have no other gods before me. It's not saying you can't have any other gods before me, right? When you're saying you can't, it's an unusual term because it means to say it's a prohibition, as Rashi says, right? It's a prohibition. But why are you using that kind of terminology? Why does the Torah use that kind of terminology? Right? So one category would be that it really means that it's just forbidden. right? An example would be, do not see your brother's lost ox and ignore it. That's a prohibition, ignoring a lost object and the obligation to return it. After the words, the Torah correctly concludes, it says, you cannot ignore it. It means it's a prohibition, right? It's a prohibition. That term, when it says you see a lost object, you can't ignore it, meaning it's a prohibition. In other words, sometimes when the Torah uses you can't, it means to say it's a prohibition. And just like you say, you shall have no other gods before me, means you shall not ignore it. It means the same thing sometimes, right? That's one category. Then there's a category, that term of you can't, concerning a person who, for example, remarries his divorcee after she married another and divorced him. So Torah then also says the first husband cannot marry her again. In this case, one cannot, because the Torah is very stringent, doesn't allow for a marriage. Again, a man was married, he divorced his wife, she married somebody else, and then she got divorced from that person, right? Then he wanted to marry her back. You cannot. The term is you cannot, right? As opposed to saying it's a prohibition. In other words, saying you are prohibited. It says lo yisuchal. Again, that term, right? So it doesn't allow the marriage to stand. In other words, when you say in that term you cannot, it means to say that the marriage doesn't stand, so much so that she doesn't need a divorce. Right? Got that? That's a different category. In other words, it's saying that you cannot. In other words, you might think you're not allowed to, but he'd have to divorce her. You shouldn't do it, right? But you'd have to divorce her. No. Lo yisuchal means it doesn't. You don't have the ability to do it. So much so that you don't even have to give a divorce afterwards, right? Is that clear? I hope I'm clear. I'm sorry. My head is a little... Okay? In other words, inherently, it's untenable by Jewish law. In other words, in Jewish law, it's untenable that if you divorced your wife, she married somebody else and got divorced, that you could marry her back again. In other words, lo yisuchal means it's untenable at all, that remarriage. Okay? Third category, as in the term lo yisuchal, is a commandment to appoint a king. So it says, lo yisuchal, you're not able to appoint a non-Jewish king over you. So Torah requires that we obey the king's very instruction. A non-Jewish king might instruct us to do something that's forbidden to Torah. Therefore, we can only appoint a Jewish king who would not go against the Torah. Accordingly, the Torah states, you cannot appoint a foreigner, a non-Jewish king over yourselves. Okay? So what do we have here is 3 different kinds of you can't, right, in Torah. When the Torah, after the Torah already stated, so the first one was was about an ox. About a lost object, right? Like an ox. So it says, you shall not ignore, right? You shall not ignore. That's a prohibition, clear prohibition. Then it repeats, you cannot ignore, right? So it's like, so that you cannot ignore means a prohibition, right? The second one was you cannot. In other words, the second one was about marrying your divorced wife that she got remarried. She married a second time, right? And got divorced. Second time, you can't remarry her. In other words, you cannot means on here, it's untenable, inherently untenable, and hence forbidden, right? It's another kind of you can't.
Rabbi, I'm so sorry. Could you explain to me? I don't understand untenable.
Untenable means not possible. Untenable means another friend. Untenable means it's not possible.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Because inherently it's not something, right?
Transitively. Okay. Okay.
So much so that you don't have to give a divorce,
Uh-huh. Right.
right?
Okay.
But for example, a divorce meaning a Jewish divorce, a Jewish
A
divorce,
get.
right?
Right.
A get,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
In other words, right? Okay.
Okay, Rabbi. Thank you.
As opposed to if a Kohen married a divorcee, he'd have to give her a get because it's not inherently not impossible. It is. He'd have to give her a divorce. But the divorcee, no. That's why it's an inherent. Got it?
Yes, Rabbi.
Okay. A Kohen's not allowed to marry a divorcee, right? Got that? What happens if he marries her? So, I mean, if he stays married to her, he loses his right as a kohen, right? He loses that right because it's tenable the marriage. It's possible the marriage, but it's prohibited. That's a difference. It's prohibited, but it's possible. So therefore, he has to give her a get in order to return to be a kohen. Got it? But in the case of remarrying the woman that you divorced and she got remarried and divorced to a second person, that's untenable. So much so that you don't even have to give a divorce. That's the point. So when the Torah says lo yisucha, that term, you're not able, right? It's a different concept than the previous one. And likewise, the third idea was altering a commandment that's inconsistent with the nature of the commandment. An example, appointing a non-Jewish king. The whole point of having a king is in order they can help you live a Jewish life. So you can't have a non-Jewish king because then it's not going to be the king. He's not going to do it. He might lead you astray, right? So you can't have a non-Jewish king as your king. Lo yisuchal, not able, right? Because it's inconsistent with the nature of the commandment of having a king. All right? Okay. Now, we have to understand in our case, though, the mitzvah of our case is that you have to eat the second tithes in Jerusalem, right? Let's go back to what we're talking about, right? There's a mitzvah of eating the second tithe. It's a mitzvah, right? Eating in Jerusalem is a separate mitzvah. You're fulfilling two mitzvahs when you do that, correct? Does that make sense? So if you can only fulfill one of these mitzvahs, it would be reasonable to think that at least, bring the second tithe. If you can't bring it to the second tithe, then you might assume, eat it at home. At least you fulfill the mitzvah of the second tithe, right? That's what the Rebbe says in this week's Sicha, right? That there's a mitzvah, eat the second tithe. It's a sacred offering. Again, you might be excused for thinking that the requirement to eat these things in Jerusalem is merely an additional mitzvah. In other words, there are two mitzvahs: eating the sacred foods the second tithe, and eating them in Jerusalem, the place where God's choice is, right? If we accept this, then it would follow that those unable to eat the sacred dish in Jerusalem, because it's beyond their control, right? Because it's beyond their control to do that, right? Then they should at least eat it at home. This way, at least they fulfill the mitzvah of eating the second tithe. It's a sacred food. But that's why the Torah comes to add a prohibition, to obligate to eat these foods in Jerusalem. It tells us that the requirement to eat the foods in Jerusalem is not merely an additional mitzvah, it's critical, the stipulation that we may not eat these foods elsewhere. That's what the prohibition is coming to do. Okay? So as long as there's only an obligation to eat the second tithe in Jerusalem, and not a prohibition of not eating it elsewhere, we would assume that if you can't make it to Jerusalem, right? Therefore, eat it at home. Now that it says that there's a prohibition, that's where Rashi says, Yochel ata. That's where Rashi said, you could eat it, right? I said, you could eat it. Right, when it says, Rashi says you could eat it, didn't just mean that you have the physical capacity to eat it. He's suggesting that we have the capacity and even the obligation to eat it outside of Jerusalem. Right, without this verse, right? You could eat it, not just you can have the physical capacity to eat it, right? But that it would be the proper thing to do is to eat it outside of Jerusalem, if there was only the positive commandment, right? Therefore, the Torah comes to add against eating outside of Jerusalem, making the mitzvah impossible to fulfill elsewhere. So the restriction, you can't, meaning in the second, meaning that while the mitzvah exists, we're barred from eating it outside of Jerusalem. So this is a unique type of you can't now. It doesn't fit into the other three categories that we had. Rashi's emphasis is over the year that this is not a typical prohibition. It uniquely prevents us from fulfilling the mitzvah rather than nullifying it. The mitzvah remains, but the Torah blocks access to it as if locking it away and taking the key, either go to Jerusalem or forfeit the mitzvah. Is there a precedent for this mitzvah, this kind? Yes. The story of the Jebusites. Abraham made an oath, right, to the Yevusim. When Sarah passed away, he made an oath that he will owns this plot of land, and as a result of having this plot of land, he made an oath that he would leave the city of Yivus, which was then known as Jerusalem. Yivus was known as Jerusalem then. And they inscribed the oath that Abraham took on large sheets to the entrance of Jerusalem. When the Jews arrived to the city, they saw Abraham's oath. So they continued. Oh, they didn't conquer it until King David came along. He conquered then and built the temple there. In other words, let's explain. We have a mitzvah. God gave us a commandment that we have to conquer Canaan, right? We have to conquer Canaan, which includes Jerusalem, because that's part of Canaan. On the other hand, We have Abraham's oath that prevented us, his descendants, from fulfilling that mandate. So we couldn't conquer Jerusalem, right? The ban, the oath was there for, I think it was, I forget now, 7 generations. And that's why it had to wait to King David. 7 generations passed. Only then he could do it. Right? Only then he could do it. So this is similar. In other words, we have something that overrides the obligation that we have to conquer the land of Canaan. Then when it came to Jerusalem, we have something that overrides it, and that's the oath that Abraham made for 7 generations, and that only was up by the time of King David, and therefore he could now take over the city. But till then, Jews couldn't do it. And they left the city alone as a result of that. That's similar to our story over here. Our story over here is we have an obligation to eat until the verse, the prohibition, we have a positive commandment to eat second tithes. We also have a positive commandment to eat in Jerusalem. So preferably do it in Jerusalem. But what happens if you can't do it in Jerusalem? What do you got to do? Got to eat it because you have a commandment to eat it. Came the prohibition, just like we have right again. Let's see the similarity over here. We have an obligation to destroy, take over the land of Canaan, which includes Jerusalem. We have an obligation to eat second tithes. Period. Right. But now comes something that modifies that and makes a prohibition. You can't anywhere else but Jerusalem. Can't anywhere else. Same thing here. We have a modification. What's the modification? Conquer the entire land except for Jerusalem. 7 generations not allowed to do it because of the oath that Abraham made. Oh, okay. That modified the original mitzvah of conquering the land. Just like the modifying the original mitzvah of the second tithes that you have to eat it, right? It's holy and you have to eat it. So therefore, that's why Rashi brings it as an example, right? Because it's a new quality of you can't. You can't means it's a modification on the thing that you're supposed to do. That's what Rashi is coming to say. Okay, folks, I'd love to continue, but I am like beat. I'm sorry. I don't think I gave the class over as well as I wanted to. I am like, I drove for 6 hours and my head is, we're going to do TRC another night, but not tonight. I think it's going to be Wednesday night.
Rabbi, shkoyach.
Wednesday night TRC. You can let everybody know TRC.
It was great. Thank you very,
Thank you.
much.
Beautiful.
God bless you. God bless you all for your kindness.
Bye.
All right.
Have
A good Nacht, a good Tavach, a good week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
God bless you all.
Take care.
Shabbat tov.